The silent town. The small town of Ravenswood had always been a place of mystery, surrounded by dense forests and a peculiar fog that never seemed to lift. The locals whispered about a curse, a tale as old as the town itself. They claimed Ravenswood wasn't just any ordinary place. It was where the dead and the living coexisted, bound by an ancient pact. Claire, a freelance journalist known for debunking myths, had heard about Ravenswood and its eerie reputation. Drawn by curiosity and the promise of a great story, she decided to visit the town. Arriving at dusk, the streets were deserted, save for the occasional flicker of lights in the windows. An unsettling silence hung in the air, interrupted only by the distant cry of crows. She checked into the only inn available, an old Victorian building with creaky floors and walls adorned with faded photographs of the town's founders. The innkeeper, an elderly woman named Martha, seemed hesitant to accommodate Claire. "You shouldn't be here after dark," Martha warned, her voice trembling. "The town has rules, and visitors rarely leave unscathed." Ignoring the warning, Claire began her investigation the next morning. She roamed the streets, interviewed the sparse population, and uncovered snippets of a chilling story. 100 years ago, Ravenswood had been prosperous until an inexplicable tragedy struck. One night, every child in the town vanished without a trace. The grief-stricken parents searched endlessly, but they found nothing except eerie drawings of shadowy figures scrawled across the walls of their homes. Desperate, the townsfolk sought the help of a mysterious hermit who lived deep in the woods. The hermit offered a solution, a ritual to bring the children back. But there was a price, one that would bind the town forever to a sinister force. That night, Claire decided to explore the forest, armed with her camera and flashlight. As she ventured deeper, the trees seemed to close in around her, the air growing colder with every step. She stumbled upon an old stone altar, covered in moss and surrounded by faintly glowing symbols. Suddenly the whispers began, soft at first, then growing louder. Claire spun around, her flashlight revealing nothing but empty woods. Yet she felt a presence, something watching her from the shadows. Her camera captured fleeting glimpses of figures, children with hollow eyes and twisted expressions. As she tried to leave, the ground beneath her feet shifted, and she fell into a hidden cavern. The walls were lined with crude drawings, similar to those found in the homes of the vanished children. At the center of the cavern was a large, mirror-like pool of water. Gazing into it, Claire saw visions of the town's past, the ritual, the children's return, and the entity that now claimed the town as its own. Terrified, Claire scrambled out of the cavern, only to find the forest alive with shadowy figures. They whispered her name, their voices a mix of sorrow and malice. She ran blindly, the figures closing in, until she burst out of the woods and into the town square. But something was wrong. The town looked different, older, as if she had stepped back in time. The streets were filled with the ghostly forms of the lost children, their laughter echoing eerily. At the center stood the entity, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. It extended a hand toward her, and for a moment, Claire felt an overwhelming urge to join the children. Summoning her willpower, she fled to the inn. Martha was waiting, her face pale. "I warned you," she said. "Now you'll never leave." The next morning, Claire awoke to find the town completely empty. Her car wouldn't start, and her phone had no signal. As she wandered, she realized the horrifying truth. She was now part of Ravenswood's curse. Her reflection in the store windows showed not herself, but a shadowy figure with hollow eyes. The story she sought had claimed her. and in the years that followed, visitors to Ravenswood would occasionally find a journal, its pages filled with Claire's frantic writings, warning them to stay away. But the warnings always came too late. Claire quickly realized she couldn't leave Ravenswood. Each attempt to drive out ended with her car mysteriously stalling near the town's edge, the fog growing thicker, almost alive, as if it were holding her back. Even walking through the woods felt like a nightmare. The trees seemed to rearrange themselves, leading her back to the deserted streets. As the days passed, her reflection became less familiar. Her once bright eyes now glowed faintly, like those of the ghostly children she had seen. Her voice echoed strangely, as if it were coming from somewhere far away. Claire felt herself fading, becoming part of the town's haunting atmosphere. One night, Claire heard faint whispers outside her window. She peered out to see the ghostly children gathered in the town square, their hollow eyes staring at her room. Gathering her courage, she stepped outside, drawn to their eerie presence. The children didn't speak, but gestured for her to follow. They led her to the forest, where the moonlight illuminated a path she hadn't noticed before. At the end of the path stood a crumbling stone mansion, its windows dark and foreboding. The children disappeared as she approached, leaving her alone. Inside the mansion, Claire found a library filled with dusty tomes and journals. One particular book caught her eye. It detailed the ritual performed a century ago. The townsfolk had sacrificed not just their children, but their own souls, binding them to the entity in exchange for eternal prosperity. But the prosperity never came. Instead, the town was abandoned by the living, left as a feeding ground for the sinister force. As she read, the room grew colder, and the shadows lengthened unnaturally. The entity appeared, towering over her, its red eyes piercing through the darkness. "You should not be here," it growled, its voice reverberating like thunder. "You have meddled with what you do not understand." Claire demanded answers. "Why me? What do you want?" The entity chuckled, a sound that chilled her to the bone. "You sought the truth, and now you are part of it. Ravenswood is mine, and so are you. Resist, and you will suffer. Accept your fate, and perhaps I will show mercy." Refusing to give in, Claire continued her search for a way to break the curse. She found references to another ritual, one that could sever the town's connection to the entity. However, it required an object of great personal value to the entity, a relic hidden deep within the cavern she had fallen into before. Determined, Claire ventured back into the woods, avoiding the shadowy figures that lurked behind every tree. The cavern was just as she remembered, but this time, she wasn't alone. The ghostly children appeared, pointing to the mirror-like pool. Claire plunged her hand into the water, feeling an intense cold that burned her skin. She pulled out a small, ornate box, its surface inscribed with the same glowing symbols she had seen on the altar. As she exited the cavern, the entity appeared, its form more menacing than ever. "You dare defy me?" It roared, the ground trembling beneath her feet. Claire held up the box. "This is your heart, isn't it? Without it, you have no power." The entity hesitated, its form flickering. The ghostly children surrounded Claire, their eyes filled with something resembling hope. Together they began chanting, their voices growing louder as the box glowed brighter. The entity let out an ear-piercing scream as its form began to dissolve. The fog lifted, the oppressive darkness receded, and the ghostly children faded away, their laughter echoing one last time. Claire found herself back in the town square, the sun shining for the first time. The streets were no longer deserted. They buzzed with life. Had she broken the curse? As she walked to the edge of town, she realized something was off. The people she passed didn't acknowledge her. She tried speaking to them, but they looked through her as if she wasn't there. Approaching the town's boundary, she was met with an invisible wall. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't cross. The truth dawned on her. Though she had freed the town, she was still trapped. The entity's final curse had bound her to Ravenswood forever. Over the years, Claire became a part of the town's legend. Visitors who came to investigate the mysterious disappearance of Ravenswood's curse would occasionally report seeing a woman with glowing eyes, watching silently from the shadows. Her warnings, etched into journals and carvings around the town, told of the price of curiosity and the dangers of seeking the truth. But the warnings always came too late, for Ravenswood had claimed another guardian, and the cycle continued. Years passed, though Claire no longer felt the passage of time. Ravenswood remained a ghost of its former self, untouched by the world beyond. Visitors came occasionally, urban explorers, ghost hunters, or curious travelers, but most never left. Those who did escape spoke of eerie encounters with the Watcher, a spectral figure that seemed to guide, warn, or haunt them. Claire had become the town's guardian, bound by the entity's final curse. She existed between life and death, unable to leave, but compelled to protect Ravenswood from falling entirely under dark forces again. Her glowing eyes, once a mark of fear, were now her weapon against lingering shadows. One stormy night, a group of thrill-seekers arrived. They were young, reckless, and dismissive of the stories surrounding Ravenswood. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they ventured into the town, laughing at the faded warnings carved into the buildings. Claire watched them from the bell tower of the old church, her translucent form blending with the darkness. The leader of the group, Ethan, seemed especially bold, or perhaps arrogant. He carried a book he claimed would reveal the secrets of the supernatural, a rare artifact he had acquired during his travels. Unknown to him, the book was a relic of the entity, a tool it could use to regain power. Claire tried to warn them. She left cryptic messages in their path, scrawling words like, "Leave now and it watches you," on dusty mirrors and walls. She whispered through the wind, making their flashlights flicker and cameras malfunction. But instead of heeding her warnings, the group grew more intrigued, convinced they were uncovering the truth behind Ravenswood's curse. Ethan, in particular, was drawn to the church. He claimed the symbols carved into the altar were part of a larger ritual and insisted they stay to perform it. Despite the growing unease of his friends, Ethan's obsession overruled their better judgment. In the dead of night, the group gathered in the church. Ethan opened the ancient book, reciting verses in a language none of them understood. Claire stood in the shadows, powerless to stop them but aware of the danger. The air grew colder, and the ground trembled as the entity began to stir, its presence creeping back into Ravenswood. The ritual wasn't a summoning, it was a binding. As Ethan spoke the final words, a blinding light erupted from the altar, and the entity's shadowy form appeared, larger and more terrifying than before. It had been weakened by Claire's actions years ago, but the ritual restored part of its power. "You dare summon me again?" the entity growled, its voice shaking the church. The group froze, their bravado replaced by terror. The entity turned to Ethan, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You belong to me now," it hissed, extending a clawed hand. As it reached for him, Claire emerged from the shadows, her form shimmering with a faint light. "You've taken enough, monster," she said, her voice echoing with newfound strength. "This ends now." The entity snarled, "You cannot defy me, Guardian. You are mine as much as they are." But Claire had learned from her years of captivity. She had studied the town's lore, piecing together fragments of the original ritual. She began to chant, her voice rising above the storm outside. The symbols on the walls glowed, binding the entity in place. The entity howled in fury, its form flickering as Claire's chant grew stronger. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the terrified faces of the group. Ethan dropped the book and tried to flee, but the entity's power still lingered, trapping them all in the church. Claire realized the truth. The entity could only be destroyed if someone willingly took its place. She looked at the frightened faces of the group and made her decision. "I release you," she whispered, her eyes meeting the entity's glowing gaze. With a final, powerful chant, Claire absorbed the entity's essence, binding it within herself. Her form became solid once more, but her glowing eyes now burned brighter, filled with the entity's malice. The storm ceased, and the group found themselves outside the church. The oppressive weight of the curse lifted. Ravenswood was free, but Claire was not. Ethan and his friends fled the town, vowing never to speak of what they had seen. Yet Ravenswood did not return to normal. Though the entity was gone, Claire now roamed the streets as its replacement, a spectral figure both protector and prisoner. Visitors who dared enter the town found a different kind of guardian. Claire no longer whispered warnings. Instead, she watched silently, her glowing eyes a reminder of the price she paid. And deep within the forest, the cavern's pool shimmered, holding a faint reflection of Claire's sacrifice. Though she had defeated the entity, its power remained, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble into Ravenswood and awaken the curse once more.